Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. This week, it's the Rupert Murdoch Show. News Corp's phone hacking scandal, the implications for the British Prime Minister, the British establishment, the UK media, and for the company itself. We'll throw in some Billy Bragg for his musical take on tabloid culture.
And they say, well, we're just giving the people what they want.
And just one non-News Corp story. Eyes in the sky, what satellites are doing for the news business. News Corporation, the world's biggest, most powerful media empire, is in crisis. Its owner, Rupert Murdoch, the most influential media tycoon the world has ever known, has been staggered. He could be headed for a fall. And Britain's political establishment may never be the same. Rebekah Brooks, the head of Murdoch's UK newspaper operations, is the highest profile casualty so far in the phone hacking scandal that began at the News of the World. She resigned on Friday, but among the questions that remain unanswered, who at News Corp knew what and when did they know it? Will this case land Murdoch in legal trouble in the U.S., where News Corp is headquartered? What was Prime Minister David Cameron thinking when he brought a scandal-tainted former News of the World editor into 10 Downing Street? And perhaps the most important question of all, where were the British police on this story? Where was Parliament? Were those two institutions wary of News Corp's political and investigative muscle and afraid to take on Murdoch and his company? Instead, it was left to a rival newspaper, The Guardian, to do the investigative work of others. Our starting point on this mega media story is London, but where the story ends is anybody's guess.
Ed Miliband.
Can the Prime Minister tell us what happened?
And I'll be setting out some proposals for precisely that in a minute.
One of the most unsavory spectacles in this most unsavory story was the debate in the House of Commons. The government and the opposition going at it over former News Corp journalists hired by both political parties.
I say this to the Prime Minister. He was warned by the Deputy Prime Minister about hiring Andy Coulson. He should apologise for the catastrophic error of judgment he made.
Let me just say this. He can stand there and ask questions about Andy Coulson. I can stand here and ask questions about Tom Baldwin.
On and on it went.
The relationships between News International and the government.
Two political parties, both veteran bedfellows of Rupert Murdoch's.
Why was nothing done?
Arguing essentially over who was what to whom.
Rupert Murdoch has been extraordinarily powerful in British politics and in British media. He was described as an unofficial member of the cabinet, and that really gives you a sense of how influential he is. For years in the 1980s, his newspapers supported Margaret Thatcher and the Conservative government, and then memorably in the mid-1990s they switched to Labour, in part because Tony Blair took a trip out to Australia in order to address Murdoch executives over at a key conference, and that helped Rupert Murdoch change his mind. Labour's courting of Murdoch helped the Labour Party win power in 1997, and again News Corp supported Labour till finally, again, switching sides to support David Cameron. Cameron goes on to win the election for the Conservative Party. You know, Rupert Murdoch likes to consider himself as the swing vote in British politics.
This story goes back 6 years and has made few people look good. The exception is The Guardian. The paper would not accept the News of the World's defense that the hacking of celebrities' phones in 2005 was the work of just one rogue reporter. The Guardian's Nick Davis published shocking new facts in 2009 that thousands of phones were hacked, including politicians. But the left-wing paper saw most of its revelations ignored.
The Guardian have always had a thing about Rupert Murdoch, so that's the starting point. I mean, Nick Davis, who's been the lead reporter on this, has done, by all, I think everyone would accept he's done a fantastic job, and he's still at it day by day. The question is, why didn't more news organisations go to it?
Other newspapers, for example, the Telegraph, the Mail, didn't move on it. It's because they were very close to the political problem. The Telegraph and the Mail support Coulson, support Cameron. They were part of the Tory establishment in many ways. And it wasn't in their particular interest to get involved in an attack on one of their people. The Guardian had a clear run at it.
Of course, that inevitably led people to conclude that actually they had something to hide themselves and didn't really like the idea that this might lead to a greater exposure of media practices.
In the space of just 1 week, everything changed. The Guardian revealed that in 2002, Millie Dowler, a missing teenager later found murdered, had her phone hacked, that families of the victims of 7/7 bombings in London and of British soldiers killed in Afghanistan were also targeted. The rest of the British media could no longer ignore the hacking story. And then, as if by magic, politicians who just last month had been sipping drinks with Rupert Murdoch at his summer party were turning on the press baron. News Corp shut down the News of the World and shelved its bid to take complete control of Britain's biggest private broadcaster, B-Sky B. They were 7 days that shook Rupert Murdoch's media world.
The public understanding of what hacking is about was changed profoundly when the ordinary reader in Britain suddenly realized it wasn't just these elite people, but ordinary people were themselves the victim of these cynical policies. Is what changed the game.
And then everything seemed to flood out at that point. I mean, one can only assume that actually the News of the World or News International knew a lot of this other stuff before Millie Dowler came up, but Millie Dowler opened the floodgates.
British media, late arrivals to the story, are now binging on it as if to make up for lost time and damaged credibility. Among the many angles they're working, why did David Cameron choose to make Andy Coulson, the former editor of the News of the World, his communications chief? Coulson had resigned from the paper over the hacking scandal, some of which happened on his watch, but Cameron hired him anyway.
And this really gave an extra piquancy to the story, and I think Rebecca Brooks firmly believes that without the Coulson link, indeed, newspapers like The Guardian may not have even bothered to pursue it.
The bigger issue, though, could prove to be the relationship between the Murdoch press and the London police. The Guardian has reported that the News of the World has paid at least £100,000 to up to 5 police officers. Is it a coincidence, then, that since 2009, a police force employing more than 50,000 people has produced less new evidence in this case than the Guardian has?
The issue is at the moment, the police. That could change the game completely at any time. If, for example, the police were to say what they really know and how much money they really took, and who did they take it from, then there'll be a whole lot of people going to prison. And so they're unlikely to do that, particularly as they're the ones who might, in fact, be sharing the cells with the executives they were talking about.
The police had another reason not to dig into the case. They may have been intimidated. At least 5 officers in the London force reportedly had their phones hacked. It's a great story, made better by the fact that, for years, Parliament didn't really want to talk about it, the police didn't really want to investigate it, and the media, with one prominent exception, didn't really want to report on it. Britain's tabloid newspaper culture is not without its defenders. One of them is Toby Young, a journalist whose book, How to Lose Friends and Alienate People, chronicled Young's time at Vanity Fair magazine and was eventually adapted for the silver screen. I spoke to Toby Young in London about his stated concern that the fallout from the hacking scandal could mean the end of Britain's rambunctious and adversarial media culture. Toby Young, thanks for joining us here on The Listening Post. You've written that the problem with the News of the World scandal, quote, could result in some of our cherished freedoms being curtailed. What do you mean by that?
Well, for a long time now, the British government has wanted to clip the wings of the press. There are 2 ways in which they want to do this and have wanted to do for some time. And that is introduce an independent regulator, not like the Press Complaints Commission, which is a self-regulating body.
Yeah, which is doing a pretty lousy job, but keep going.
Which isn't doing a great job. And the second is to introduce some kind of privacy law. And my worry is that in the wake of this scandal, something like both of those things will happen. And as a consequence, the press will be much more cautious when it comes to investigating wrongdoing.
Let's just look at regulation for a minute. The British television industry, television journalism, is heavily regulated. They seem to be able to do the job effectively. Why shouldn't the press be regulated, if not as much, to a greater degree than the way they're regulated now by a body that clearly failed to do the job in this case?
One danger with regulating the press much more scrupulously than it's regulated at present is it would be very difficult to apply that same regulation to the internet. At the moment, newspapers have an enormously hard time competing with the internet, and as I'm sure you know, most newspapers are shedding readers on a daily basis. Our business, the newspaper business, is in terminal decline. And I think if you regulate it and render it unable to compete with an unregulated internet, you're going to accelerate that decline.
You think Rupert Murdoch over the years has done great things for British journalism?
I think Rupert Murdoch, on balance, has been a force for good.
Like what?
I certainly wouldn't make apologies for what some of his reporters are alleged to have done. And
Tell me the good stuff.
I think, OK, here's the good stuff. He's kept the Times afloat, in spite of the fact that it loses tens of millions of pounds a year.
Does it occur to you that maybe he keeps the Times afloat because it is a very influential tool?
Well...
or do you think it's an act of charity?
I don't think it's an act of charity, but nevertheless, if it wasn't for Rupert Murdoch, it's doubtful that the Times would exist in its present form.
He has never put it up for sale. Alexander Lebedev,
here's the difference
Alexander Lebedev bought the Independent and the Evening Standard. He assumed tens of millions of pounds of debt in taking on those newspapers. He runs those newspapers presumably at a loss. Rupert Murdoch isn't,
yes,
and he manages to do it without, as far as we know, breaking the law.
Of course, there are other newspapers that proprietors are willing to take on that lose money hand over fist. And you mentioned The Independent. Another example
so he's
is
not the only
Observer.
One,
he's not the only one.
Yeah.
But if you look at those newspapers, they're edited by skeleton staffs. The Observer is edited by a staff of 5. The Times is a proper, serious global newspaper with a huge staff. And if News Corp does divest itself of News International, which looks increasingly likely, and the Times is sold in a fire sale, you can bet your bottom dollar that a majority of the staff will be sacked and it will be turned into a threadbare skeleton operation. It won't be the serious newspaper it is today.
Do you think, as a British voter, that Rupert Murdoch has too much influence in this country?
I think Rupert Murdoch probably does have too much influence, but let's not forget that he doesn't just throw that weight behind one political party. If he was just backing the Tories,
which he
then
does
it would be more of an issue.
90% of the time.
Well, he backed Tony Blair and he backed Gordon Brown.
Right.
For
Tony Blair
several
flew
years.
halfway across the world. So I'm just asking you, as a British voter, when you see a political leader of your party fly halfway across the world to win the blessing of Rupert Murdoch in 1995, that he then gets in 1997, and Blair magically becomes the first Labour Prime Minister in a long time to be elected in this country. David Cameron, the second person into Downing Street after Cameron moved into Downing Street, was Rupert Murdoch. He's the only person from outside that government to have 2 meetings at Downing Street within the first week of Cameron moving in. I'm just wondering how you feel about that.
Clearly, you know, it's a source of concern that,
that
one person should command so much influence over our prime ministers. But to blame Murdoch for that, isn't it kind of getting it back to front?
I'm not
the
blaming
prime
Murdoch.
ministers themselves, the
not,
political leaders themselves, shouldn't behave in such a craven, obsequious manner. And now to see them turning around and saying, "Ooh, Murdoch's a ghastly creature. He needs his wings clipped." It's like, well, you went to his party 2 weeks ago.
Where does this story end when it comes to a halt eventually? And who ends up suffering the most? News Corp, British political establishment, the police? The police did not investigate this story, and eventually someone is going to have to pay for that.
The New York Times ran a story earlier this week in which it said that the police investigation into the News of the World phone hacking was hampered because the News International had the goods on the police investigators. They hacked their phones. They knew that they weren't squeaky clean, and shortly afterwards, the investigation was wrapped up. I think that's a bit far-fetched. I think that a much more plausible explanation is that they simply didn't have the resources to investigate this properly. The allocation of resources within our police forces,
what do you
particularly
mean
the
they
Metropolitan
didn't have
Police.
The resources. The Guardian had the resources in one reporter, and he did that.
It looks as though 4,000 people's phones were hacked. Okay, Nick Davis, he's an incredibly dogged reporter, the hero of the hour, Woodward and Bernstein wrapped up in one. It looks like he's uncovered, half a dozen incidents of people's phones being tapped. Being hacked into. The police were faced with 4,000 cases of phone hacking. I mean, it's not a stretch. It's not to make an excuse for them to say they simply didn't have the resources to investigate wrongdoing on such an incredibly wide scale. I saw the new Harry Potter movie yesterday, and it won't come as a surprise to fans of the franchise to learn that this plucky little bespectacled boy eventually brings down Voldemort.
He who must not be mentioned.
He who must not be mentioned. And you see him disintegrating at the end, and there is actually an uncanny...
Oh, ruin it for us.
Sorry. I think most people know how it's going to end. But there's an uncanny resemblance between Harry Potter and Alan Rusbridger, the editor of The Guardian, and seeing Voldemort brought low at the end of the Harry Potter series was a bit like, you know, seeing Alan Rusbridger, this kind of rather mild-mannered, bespectacled English gent, bringing down, you know, this evil lord. And it's hard not to side with kind of David in this David versus Goliath battle, and it's hard not to admire the journalism of The Guardian, particularly Nick Davis. But I think in all of this, we shouldn't ignore what Rupert Murdoch has done for our industry. Rupert Murdoch is an extraordinary buccaneering tycoon, prepared to take incredible risks. And if he's amassed too much power, if he has too much money, it's only because he's been such an effective businessman. And, you know, for these MPs to be kind of creeping around like vultures, kind of picking at what they hope will soon be the corpse of this man, it does slightly turn my stomach.
Toby Young, thanks for talking to us.
Thank you.
When governments sponsor technological innovation like satellites in space, there's usually something in it for them, and it often has to do with national security. But when those projects are turned over to the public, they can take on a life of their own. Surveillance satellites were first launched at the height of the Cold War so that the US and the Soviet Union could keep an eye on each other. But they have since become an increasingly powerful journalistic tool. Images of Earth captured by commercial satellite companies, curated by software applications like Google Earth, and then contextualized by map makers are not only providing the media with new ways of illustrating stories, but new ways of investigating them. The Listening Post's Meenakshi Ravi now on the fusion of satellite imagery and the coverage of news.
In the early 80s, when British prog rock band the Alan Parsons Project sang about surveillance from on high, satellite imagery was still the exclusive domain of governments and spy agencies.
In the sky, looking at you, I can read your mind.
But it wasn't long before the public gained the power to use these cameras, positioned hundreds of kilometers above the Earth to reveal previously unknown truths about the world we live in.
There's a certain mystique and mystery associated with satellite imagery because the technology was born from the intelligence community. So as this technology has moved from the world of intelligence to the world of commerce, this mystique moves with it.
We do know that a zone of deadly radiation is being released from the damaged plant, and the accident is far from over.
The first real use of it was when the Russian nuclear reactor at Chernobyl exploded, and U.S. News took a thermal image, a really grainy thermal image of the reactor, and that forced the Russian government to have to admit that the problem was much more severe than it really was.
For the first time, news organizations realized that satellite images could become part of their news-gathering toolkit.
Looked like before the earthquake and after.
Well, every story has a who, what, why, when, and where. And commercial satellite imagery taken from Earth imaging satellites in outer space can help with many components of those questions.
But in the 1980s, price was an obstacle.
When the first high-resolution commercial satellites were launched, it was, $2,000 or $3,000 for a scene, and you had to order it fresh. And then the satellite would take a picture and it would be cloudy. And so you'd have to wait until there was a cloud-free day to get an image of what you wanted.
But by the 1990s, as the image archives of companies like GOI and Digital Globe grew, the price dropped, enough so that in 2004, American magazine Reason used satellite images to make a provocative point about privacy.
They had a special cover for every single subscriber that showed a satellite view of your location. So it would just pull off the address from your subscription. And that was quite unnerving at the time, just like, ooh, because it was this whole idea of somebody's watching you.
In 2005, Google decided to get in on the game and changed everything. They purchased a company called Keyhole and rebranded its virtual globe program as Google Earth, giving satellite imagery and powerful tools to understand it to the masses.
Well, Google Earth has virtually changed the way we look at the world. There's been over 700 million downloads of the Google Earth program. That attests to its value and its utility in modern societies.
They basically have gone to the satellite companies, Digital Globe, GOI, and they have basically bought out their entire archive of cloud-free imagery and populated the Google Earth database with nothing but clear, beautiful images that are essentially free.
These images have made Google Earth a useful tool for learning geography, but it's also created a new way of consuming media. Take a spin around Google Earth and you'll find New York Times stories plotted by location and thousands of geotagged photos and videos pinpointing everything from political turmoil to bored teenagers. More impressive are the ways that people have used Google Earth to create mashups of maps and data, as first seen in 2005 with chicagocrime.org.
So the term mashup is actually from music, where you take two songs and mash them up together.
Last night a DJ saved my life.
And in terms of a data mashup, it's just quite simply taking, like Adrian Holabadi did. He just took crime information and he put it on a map. And so he was taking geographical information and crime information and mashing them up, pulling them together.
Last year, when protests broke out in the Thai capital, blogger Richard Barrow created Bangkok Dangerous, a live, continuously updated city map that showed where violence was breaking out. The mashup was a tool for ordinary people looking to steer clear of trouble and journalists eager to report on it. Map mashups are good at showing where crimes have already taken place, but the Satellite Sentinel project took it further, trying to prevent crimes, war crimes, before they could happen. Bankrolled by actor George Clooney, the project ordered custom satellite images of the border between North and South Sudan in the hope that the increased attention would dissuade either side from military aggression.
You can Google Earth my house anytime you want. I want people who do really evil acts to enjoy the same level of celebrity that I do.
We were late to Rwanda. We were late to Cambodia. We were late to Congo. We were late to Darfur. This time, we have an opportunity to be out front.
The GOI was able to collect about 400 square kilometers over Sudan on the day that voting for the referendum for secession took place. And that imagery was provided to the United Nations and to Google Earth.
Using satellite images to map crime statistics, monitor breaking news, and preempt war is not only a clever use of technology, it's creating a new form of journalism.
What does a journalist do is that they gather information and then convey that in a compelling way to audiences. That's what they do. And I think, in this day and age, some ways we're doing that is through interactive graphics or interactive experiences.
But most news organizations have yet to use satellite imagery to its full potential.
Imagery is never really drives a story. It's just used as a special effect or as a graphic element in a story that was already written. It's essentially like a Ferrari that's stuck in first gear.
News organizations around the world could use imagery more effectively if they fully integrated it into the news gathering process. And satellite imagery should not just be used as a graphics tool or in place of a map. Satellite imagery should be used as an editorial tool to help drive a story. And media who use satellite imagery very effectively will not only cover the news, they'll make the news.
Because, as those who study satellite images for a living will tell you, the truth is out there.
Finally, back to News Corp by way of Billy Bragg. Bragg is a British songwriter who's been known to get a little political. He's written a tune called Never Buy the Sun, and he's posted it online. The chorus refers to Scousers. That's what Britons call people from Liverpool. Some of them have been boycotting The Sun, a Murdoch-owned tabloid, ever since 1989 to protest the paper's coverage of the Hillsborough Stadium football disaster. So that's what the song's chorus is about. But the rest of the song touches on many of the key points in the more contemporary phone hacking scandal. We've made this Bragg track our web video of the week, and we'll see you next time at the Listening Post.
Someone's hiding in the bushes with a telephoto lens, while their editor assures them the means justify the ends. 'Cause we only hunt celebrities and it's all a bit of fun, but the Scousers never buy the Sun. tabloids make their money betting bull baffles brains, and they cynically hold up their hands if anyone complains, and they say, well, we're just giving the people what they want. Well, they're crying out for justice, people crying out for justice in the corridors of power. They all sit down to sup with the devil and his minions, and they ask for his opinions, and the politicians wring their hands and say what's to be done. But the Scousers never buy the sun.